They cuffed him like a criminal, slammed his face into the pavement and laughed when they saw him bleed. All because he chose to stay silent. All because they didn't recognize the regimental patch stitched onto the bag they'd just stomped on. But what they didn't realize was that the man they arrested wasn't a poser or a fraud. He was a royal guard. And 5 minutes later, a colonel arrived who made sure they would never forget it. Before we show you what happened next, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe, because what you're about to see just might restore your faith in justice. The rain hammered against the glass walls of Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5 with the relentless fury of a London winter. Inside the arrivals hall, weary travellers shuffled past the departure boards, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of electronic displays announcing delayed flights and gate changes. The usual chaos of one of the world's busiest airports seemed muted by the storm raging outside, as if nature itself demanded a moment of silence. Lance Sergeant Daniel Wicks stood motionless near Exit 3, a statue among the moving crowd. At 28, he possessed the kind of stillness that only came from years of military discipline. His civilian clothes, a simple navy peacoat and dark trousers, couldn't disguise the ramrod posture that had been drilled into him since his first day at the infantry training center. His eyes, sharp as flint, tracked the crowd without blinking, cataloguing faces and movements with the unconscious precision of a man trained to protect the crown. At his feet lay a long garment bag, its black leather surface bearing the unmistakable crest of the Coldstream Guards, a royal cipher that had commanded respect for over 3 centuries. Inside that bag lay not just cloth and thread, but history itself. The scarlet tunic, the bearskin cap, the gold braiding each element, a testament to tradition older than most nations. Wicks had been travelling for 14 hours, returning from a ceremonial posting in Gibraltar, where he'd stood guard at the governor's residence. The flight delays had tested his patience, but not his composure. He'd learned long ago that a Queen's Guard never showed frustration, never betrayed weakness. Even in civilian clothes, even off-duty, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had sworn an oath to serve something greater than himself. The terminal's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the small scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from his deployment to Afghanistan 3 years prior. He'd been a different man then, younger, more eager to prove himself. The army had shaped him, molded him into something harder, more focused. But it was the guards that had given him purpose, had taught him that true strength lay not in aggression, but in absolute self-control. A child's laughter echoed through the terminal, and Wicks's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He watched a young girl chase after her father, her small hands reaching for his coattails. For a moment, the guardsman's mask slipped, revealing the man beneath, someone who understood that everything he did, every moment of vigilance, was for people like that little girl and her family. From their patrol car parked outside the terminal, PC James Reeves watched the scene unfold through Rain Street windows. At 34, Reeves had been on the Metropolitan Police Force for 12 years, long enough to develop the cynical worldview that seemed to afflict so many officers. His receding hairline and the permanent scowl lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "Check out RoboCop over there," Reeves muttered to his partner, nudging Sergeant Matt Harrison with his elbow. "£5 says he's carrying something he shouldn't be." Harrison, younger and less jaded, squinted through the rain. "Looks like military to me. See the way he's standing. That's parade ground posture if I've ever seen it." But Reeves was already out of the car, his mind made up. In his experience, anyone who stood that still, that alert, was hiding something. The rain immediately soaked through his uniform as he approached the terminal entrance, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the airport's harsh lighting. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wall, but it did nothing to improve his mood. The flight delays had put him behind schedule, and his sergeant had been breathing down his neck about arrest quotas. He needed something, anything, to justify the overtime he'd been claiming. Wicks sensed the approach before he saw the officer. Years of training had honed his peripheral vision, taught him to recognize the particular gait of someone with authority. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the policeman's presence without appearing confrontational. "Afternoon, sir," Wicks said, his voice carrying the crisp diction of a man who had spent years barking orders on parade grounds. "Is there something I can help you with?" The politeness seemed to irritate Reeves further. He'd dealt with too many smart-mouthed civilians who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. "I need to see some identification now." Without hesitation, Wicks reached into his jacket and produced his military ID card, a laminated rectangle that bore his photograph, rank, and unit designation. He'd expected this might happen. Airports were naturally suspicious places, and his stillness had probably attracted attention. Reeves snatched the ID with more force than necessary, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "Queen's Guard," his tone dripped with skepticism. "Let's see what's in the bag, soldier." The word soldier came out like an insult, and Wicks felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He'd earned his rank through years of service, had stood guard at Buckingham Palace, had protected royalty and dignitaries, but he kept his voice level, professional. "Ceremonial uniform, Sir, wool and gold thread. I'd prefer not to open it in this weather. The rain could damage the fabric." It was a reasonable request. The uniform inside that bag was worth thousands of pounds and represented centuries of military tradition. More importantly, it was scheduled to be worn at a ceremonial function the following morning. Any damage would be both costly and deeply embarrassing. But Reeves had already decided this man was trouble. The military bearing, the calm responses, the way he seemed to command respect without saying a word, it all rubbed against the officer's own insecurities. "I said open it." The confrontation escalated with the sudden violence of a summer storm. Reeves grabbed Wicks by the arm, his fingers digging into the civilian jacket. For a moment, the guardsman didn't move, his training warring with his instincts. He could have easily broken the grip, could have put the officer on the ground in seconds. But his oath wasn't just to the crown, it was to the people the crown represented, including overzealous police officers who didn't know when to stop. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to let go," Wicks said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I'm a serving member of Her Majesty's forces, and I'm willing to cooperate with any reasonable request." The word reasonable seemed to snap something in Reeves. His face flushed red, and he threw a wild punch that caught Wicks on the cheek. The blow was clumsy, more angry than skilled, but it was enough to draw blood. Wicks absorbed the impact without retaliation, his head snapping back, but his feet remaining planted. Years of discipline held him in place, even as every instinct screamed at him to fight back. He'd been trained to kill with his bare hands, had survived firefights in Afghanistan, had faced down terrorists and insurgents, but this was different. This was home, and these were his people, however misguided. "I will not resist," he said quietly, allowing himself to be forced to his knees on the wet pavement outside the terminal. The rain immediately soaked through his civilian clothes, but he maintained his dignity even as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Around them, a crowd had begun to gather. Passengers pressed against the terminal windows, their phones already recording the scene. A woman in a red jacket gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched a man in civilian clothes being brutalized by police. "He's not fighting back," someone whispered. "Why isn't he fighting back?" But Wicks knew why. Fighting back would have meant abandoning everything he'd sworn to uphold. A Queen's Guard didn't lower himself to the level of his attackers. A Queen's Guard endured, remained steadfast, showed the world what true strength looked like. Harrison, the younger officer, looked increasingly uncomfortable as his partner yanked on Wicks's arms, trying to force him fully to the ground. "Jim, maybe we should shut up," Reeves snarled, his authority mask slipping to reveal the frightened, angry man beneath. "This bastard thinks he's better than us. Well, he's not." Inside the terminal, Flight Lieutenant Sarah Morrison watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She'd been waiting for her connecting flight to Edinburgh when the commotion had drawn her attention. As a serving RAF officer, she recognized the signs immediately: the bearing, the restraint, the way the man being arrested carried himself even under duress. Her fingers flew over her phone's screen, dialing a number she'd memorized years ago during her own training. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, unmistakably military. "Henshaw, Colonel, it's Morrison. We've got a situation at Heathrow. One of ours is in cuffs. Coldstream Guards, I think. The police have him down, and he's not resisting." There was a pause, then a sound like ice cracking. "Details now." Colonel Alistair Henshaw had been reviewing personnel files in his office at Wellington Barracks when the call came. At 52, He was a man who had earned his rank through 30 years of exemplary service, including tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Northern Ireland. His grey eyes had seen the worst humanity had to offer, and his weathered hands had signed too many letters of condolence to grieving families. But nothing in his military career had prepared him for the fury that surged through him as Morrison described the scene at Heathrow. One of his men, one of the Queen's own, being brutalized by police officers who should have known better. "I want a car," he said, his voice deadly calm now, "and get me the details on every officer involved." The black Range Rover that screeched to a halt outside Heathrow's Terminal 5 20 minutes later carried more than just a senior military officer. It carried the weight of centuries of tradition, the authority of the Crown, and the barely contained rage of a man who had sworn to protect those under his command. Henshaw emerged from the vehicle like a force of nature, his dress uniform immaculate despite the rain. The red tabs on his collar caught the light, and the ribbons on his chest spoke of campaigns fought and won. But it was his eyes that made the crowd part, grey as winter steel and just as unforgiving. P.C. Reeves was still holding Wicks on the ground when the colonel approached. The guardsman's cheek was swelling now, a dark bruise spreading across his weathered face, but his eyes remained steady, focused on some distant point that seemed to transcend the immediate humiliation. "Release him," Henshaw said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Now." Reeves looked up, taking in the uniform, the rank insignia, the barely controlled fury radiating from the older man. "This is a police matter, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." The colonel's smile was winterish. "I am Colonel Alistair Henshaw, commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards. The man you have in restraints is under my command, and you are interfering with a member of Her Majesty's forces." He knelt beside Wicks's, his voice dropping to a whisper that only the guardsman could hear. "How badly are you hurt?" "Sergeant, fit for duty, sir," Wicks replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "They haven't broken anything that can't be fixed." Henshaw's jaw tightened. He'd seen men broken by war, had watched soldiers face down insurgents and terrorists, but this was different. This was a betrayal of everything they'd sworn to protect. Standing, he turned back to Reeves with the cold precision of a man delivering a death sentence. "You have assaulted a serving member of the British Army. You have violated the very oath you swore to uphold, and you have disgraced the uniform you wear." The crowd around them had grown larger, phones recording every word. But Henshaw didn't care about publicity or public relations. He cared about justice, about honor, about ensuring that those who served the Crown received the respect they had earned. "I am placing you under arrest," he continued, his voice carrying across the terminal forecourt. "Under Section 24 of the Armed Forces Act, assault on active duty personnel. You will be tried by military tribunal, and I will personally ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions." The military police who had arrived with the colonel moved with practiced efficiency, their own handcuffs clicking shut around Reeves' wrists. The irony wasn't lost on the watching crowd. Arresters had become the arrested. The transformation was immediate and profound. Harrison, the younger officer, found himself backing away from the scene, his face pale with the sudden understanding of what they'd done. Around them, the crowd's murmur grew louder, phones continuing to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Harrison began, his voice shaking. "We were just following procedure." "Procedure?" Henshaw's voice could have cut glass. "Your procedure was to assault an unarmed man who was cooperating fully with your investigation. Your procedure was to ignore his military identification and treat him like a common criminal." The colonel turned to the garment bag, still lying on the wet pavement where Wicks had dropped it when the altercation began. With reverent hands, he lifted it, brushing away the raindrops that had gathered on its surface. The zipper opened with a soft whisper, revealing the scarlet tunic within. The crowd fell silent as Henshaw lifted the uniform, holding it up to the grey London sky. The gold braiding caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, and the regimental badges gleamed with the weight of history. "This uniform," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the watching crowd, "has stood at the scene for 100 years. It has guarded the Queen through war and peace, through triumph and tragedy. It has been worn by men who died for this country, who bled for this country, who sacrificed everything for the ideals we hold dear." He turned back to Reeves, who was now secured in the military police's custody. "And you dared to lay hands on the man who wears it. The woman in the red jacket, who had been recording the entire encounter, stepped forward. Her voice was clear, carrying the authority of someone who had seen injustice and refused to remain silent. "I saw everything," she announced. "This man did nothing wrong. He was polite, he was cooperative, and he was brutalized for no reason other than the fact that he stood differently than the rest of us." Others in the crowd murmured their agreement. A businessman in an expensive suit nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. Disgraceful." The man was just standing there, minding his own business. An elderly veteran, his RAF tie visible beneath his raincoat, pushed through the crowd. "Sergeant," he called out to Wicks, who was finally being helped to his feet. "I served with the RAF for 30 years. I want you to know that not all of us have forgotten what service means." Henshaw helped Wicks to his feet, his hands steady as he brushed the rain and dirt from the younger man's jacket. "Can you stand, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." Wicks's voice was steady, professional, but Henshaw could see the pain in his eyes, not just physical, but the deeper hurt of betrayal. This was his country, his people, and they had turned on him. "The uniform doesn't kneel," Henshaw said softly, his words meant for Wicks's, but carrying to the watching crowd. "Not to tyrants, not to terrorists, and certainly not to bullies with badges." The military police were already loading Reeves into their vehicle, the disgraced officer's protests falling on deaf ears. Harrison, still free but clearly shaken, approached Henshaw with the careful steps of a man walking on thin ice. "Colonel, sir, I want to make it clear that I didn't support what happened here. I tried to stop him, but you didn't," Henshaw interrupted. "You stood by and watched while your partner assaulted a serving member of the armed forces. You enabled this disgrace through your inaction." The younger officer's face crumpled. "Sir, I didn't know what to do. He's my senior officer, and you chose loyalty to a corrupt superior over loyalty to justice," Henshaw said, his voice softening slightly. "That's a choice you'll have to live with, Constable, but at least you have the opportunity to learn from it." The rain had begun to ease as the immediate crisis passed, but the emotional storm was far from over. Henshaw guided Wicks toward the terminal, away from the crowd and the cameras, seeking a quiet space where they could talk without an audience. Inside the terminal, they found a small cafe that had been closed for the evening. The colonel's authority was enough to secure them a private table, away from the curious stares and whispered conversations of other passengers. "Tell me what happened," Henshaw said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair. "From the beginning." Wicks straightened, falling automatically into the formal posture of a soldier giving a report. "I was waiting for my transport, sir. The flight from Gibraltar was delayed, and I was standing by exit 3 when the officers approached. They asked for identification, which I provided immediately. When they requested to search my kit bag, I explained that it contained ceremonial uniform and asked if we could move to a covered area to protect it from the rain." "Reasonable request," Henshaw murmured. "Continue." The senior officer became agitated. "Sir." He grabbed my arm and demanded I open the bag immediately. I attempted to de-escalate, but he became physically aggressive. He struck me once in the face, and I made the decision not to resist or retaliate. Henshaw studied the younger man's face, noting the professional distance in his report, but he could see the underlying tension, the way Wicks's hands trembled almost imperceptibly. This was a man who had been trained to kill, who had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, reduced to a victim by the very people he'd sworn to protect. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" the colonel asked. "You had every right to protect yourself from assault." Wicks's was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the terminal windows. "Because that's not who we are, sir. We're not thugs or street fighters. We're the Queen's Guard. We protect, we serve, we endure." Fighting back would have made me no better than him. It was exactly the answer Henshaw had expected, and it filled him with both pride and rage. Pride in the character of the men under his command, and rage at a system that would punish such nobility. "The video is already going viral," Henshaw said, showing Wicks his phone. The footage captured by the woman in red had been uploaded to social media, where it was being shared thousands of times. "The whole world is watching." Wicks looked at the screen, his expression carefully neutral. "I hope it shows what we stand for, sir. Not just the uniform, but the principles behind it." "It does," Henshaw assured him, "but it also shows what we're up against. There are people in this country who have forgotten what service means, who see discipline as weakness and restraint as cowardice. They sat in silence for a moment, two soldiers contemplating the changing nature of the society they served. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and the first hints of sunset were beginning to break through the clouds. "What happens now, sir?" Wicks asked. Henshaw's smile was grim. "Now we make sure this never happens again. We're going to pursue this through every legal channel available. Military tribunal, civilian court, internal affairs, investigation, everything. Those officers are going to learn that actions have consequences. And the uniform ceremony tomorrow. You'll be there," Henshaw said firmly, bruised but unbroken. "The world needs to see that we don't back down, that we don't let bullies define us." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Henshaw placed a hand on Wicks's shoulder. "You did well today, Sergeant. Under impossible circumstances, you maintained your dignity and honored your oath. That's not something everyone could have done." Wicks nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Sir, I keep thinking about that officer. He was so angry, so ready to see the worst in me. What made him like that?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Henshaw had seen it before, the gradual erosion of respect for authority, the cynicism that infected some officers like a disease. "Fear," he said simply. "Fear of being shown up, of being reminded that there are still people in this world who believe in something greater than themselves." The journey back to Wellington Barracks was quiet, the Range Rover's engine humming softly as they navigated through London's evening traffic. Wicks sat in the passenger seat, his civilian clothes now rumpled and stained from the encounter, but his bearing unchanged. If anything, the ordeal seemed to have reinforced his natural discipline. Henshaw used the time to make calls, his voice clipped and professional as he spoke to various officials. The military police, the Ministry of Defence, even members of Parliament who needed to be briefed on the situation. Each conversation was a chess move in a larger game, positioning the armed forces to protect one of their own, while maintaining the delicate balance of civil-military relations. "The Minister wants to see you tomorrow," Henshaw said, after ending another call. "After the ceremony, he's concerned about the public relations aspect." "What should I tell him, sir?" "The truth," Henshaw replied. "That you conducted yourself with honor under impossible circumstances. That you upheld the finest traditions of the service even when others abandoned theirs." They passed Buckingham Palace, its familiar silhouette a reminder of everything they served. The Queen's standard was flying, indicating she was in residence. Somewhere in those ancient walls, the monarch they had sworn to protect was going about her evening routine, unaware that one of her guards had been humiliated in her name. "Do you think she'll hear about it?" Wicks asked, following Henshaw's gaze. "She hears about everything," the colonel replied, "and she'd be proud of how you handled yourself. The crown doesn't abandon its servants, Sergeant, not ever." At the barracks, they were met by other members of the regiment. Word had spread quickly through the military network, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers who had never met Wicks personally came forward to offer their support, their anger at the injustice matching Henshaw's own. "It's not just about you," explained Captain James Morrison, a young officer who had served with Wicks in Afghanistan. "It's about all of us. If they can do this to a guardsman, what does that say about how they see the military?" The question hung in the air like smoke. For generations, the British military had enjoyed a special relationship with the civilian population. Soldiers were respected, honored, seen as the embodiment of national values. But something had changed in recent years, a gradual erosion of that mutual respect. "We're not above the law," Henshaw said carefully. "We never have been, and we never should be. But we deserve the same protection under that law as any other citizen." What happened today was a violation of that basic principle. The medical officer who examined Wicks found a mild concussion, bruised ribs, and various cuts and scrapes. Nothing serious, but enough to serve as a reminder of the violence he'd endured. The doctor, a veteran himself, shook his head as he cleaned the wounds. 30 years I've been patching up soldiers," he muttered. "Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland, I've seen it all. But this is the first time I've had to treat a guardsman who was beaten by his own people." As the evening wore on, the barracks became a hub of activity. Lawyers arrived to discuss the legal implications. Public relations officers crafted statements for the media, and senior officers debated the best way forward. But through it all, Wicks remained calm, professional, focused on his duty. "The ceremony tomorrow," he said to Henshaw. "I need to be perfect. After what happened today, I can't give anyone reason to doubt. "You'll be perfect," Henshaw assured him. "You always are." The next morning dawned clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the previous day's storm. Wicks stood before the mirror in his quarters, carefully adjusting his ceremonial uniform. The scarlet tunic, saved from the rain and carefully pressed overnight, bore the gold braiding and regimental badges that marked him as one of the Queen's own. The bruise on his cheek was still visible, a dark reminder of the previous day's encounter. But rather than hide it, Wicks wore it like a badge of honor. It was proof that he had endured, that he had maintained his dignity even under assault. The ceremony itself was a small affair, a changing of the guard at one of the lesser royal residences, but for Wicks it carried special significance. This was his first official duty since the incident, his chance to show the world that he remained unbroken as he marched across the courtyard, his boots clicking against the ancient stones. Wicks felt the weight of history on his shoulders. Generations of guardsmen had walked these same paths, had stood these same posts, had faced their own challenges with the same quiet dignity. The crowd that had gathered to watch was larger than usual, drawn by the news coverage of the airport incident. Among them, Wicks spotted several familiar faces: the woman in red who had recorded the confrontation, the elderly RAF veteran who had spoken up in his defense, even some of the airport staff who had witnessed the events. But it was the small group of police officers standing at the back of the crowd that caught his attention. They weren't in uniform, but he recognized them immediately. They had come to see him, to understand what they had tried to break. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Wicks performing his duties with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into him over years of training. But as he stood at attention, his mind wandered to the larger questions raised by the previous day's events. What did it mean to serve in a society that no longer fully understood the concept of service? How could the military maintain its values when the civilian population seemed increasingly cynical about those same values? These were questions without easy answers, challenges that would require careful thought and delicate handling. After the ceremony, as Wicks was changing out of his ceremonial uniform, Colonel Henshaw approached with an update on the legal proceedings. P.C. Reeves had been charged with assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military tribunal would convene within the week, and early indications suggested the case was solid. "What about the other officer?" Wicks asked. "Harrison, suspended, pending investigation," Henshaw replied. "He may face lesser charges, but his career is effectively over. You can't stand by and watch something like this happen and expect to continue serving." It was harsh justice, but necessary. The military had always operated under stricter standards than civilian society, and those standards had to be maintained if the institution was to retain its effectiveness. Sir Wicks said carefully, "I've been thinking about what this means for the future. If this can happen to me, it can happen to any of us. We need to be prepared." Henshaw nodded. "I've been having the same thoughts. We're looking at enhanced training for all personnel on civilian interactions, better coordination with local police forces, and clearer protocols for handling situations like this. And the media coverage, mixed, as expected. Some outlets are portraying you as a victim, others are questioning why you didn't fight back. But overall, the public response has been supportive. People understand that you were wronged." The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of activity. The video of the airport incident continued to circulate on social media, sparking debates about police accountability, military-civilian relations, and the nature of courage in the modern world. Wicks found himself at the center of a national conversation he had never sought. Interview requests poured in from every major news outlet, but Henshaw advised against accepting most of them. "Let your actions speak for themselves," he counseled. "The moment you start explaining, you start looking defensive." The military tribunal convened in a secure facility at Aldershot, its proceedings closed to the public but extensively documented. P.C. Reeves, now suspended and facing multiple charges, sat in the defendant's chair with the defeated posture of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. Wicks testified with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the ordeal. He recounted the events without emotion, sticking to facts and avoiding speculation about motives or intentions. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that his military training had somehow intimidated the officers, Wicks responded with quiet dignity. "I was trained to serve and protect," he said. "If my bearing suggested otherwise, then I failed in my duty to represent the values of the service properly." It was a masterful response, turning the attorney's attack into an affirmation of military values. The tribunal members, all experienced officers themselves, recognized the skill with which Wicks had handled the question. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. P.C. Reeves was found guilty of assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. His sentence included dismissal from the force, a significant fine, and a permanent bar from future law enforcement employment. It was the end of a career, but Henshaw felt it was justified. "Justice has been served," he told Wicks after the hearing. "Not just for you, but for every member of the armed forces who puts their life on the line for this country." The civilian court proceedings were more complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and competing interests. But the video evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had firmly shifted in Wicks's favor. The case was settled out of court, with significant damages paid to Wicks and a formal apology from the Metropolitan Police. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the change in police training protocols. The incident had highlighted serious gaps in how officers were prepared to interact with military personnel, and new programs were quickly implemented to address these deficiencies. "Your sacrifice wasn't in vain," Henshaw told Wicks as they reviewed the new training materials. "Other soldiers won't have to endure what you did." Wicks nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "I keep thinking about P.C. Reeves," he admitted. "What he must be going through now. His career is over, his reputation destroyed. I don't take pleasure in that." It was a remarkably generous response from someone who had been so wronged, but it was also typically British, reflecting the values of fair play and proportionality that had always been central to the national character. "That's what separates us from them," Henshaw observed. "We don't seek revenge, we seek justice. And justice has been served." The final chapter of the story unfolded on a crisp autumn morning 6 months after the incident. Wicks stood at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace, his scarlet tunic immaculate in the morning light. The tourists who gathered to watch the changing of the guard had no idea they were looking at a man who had become a symbol of quiet courage. Among the crowd, a familiar figure caught his eye. It was the woman in red, now wearing a dark coat against the autumn chill. She had continued to follow the story, attending the tribunal proceedings and advocating for military personnel rights. When their eyes met, she offered a small gesture of respect that spoke volumes. Also present was the elderly RAF veteran, now a regular visitor to the palace. He had taken to bringing his grandson to watch the ceremonies, using them as teaching moments about service and sacrifice. "That's what courage looks like," he would tell the boy. "Not the loud, flashy kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind that endures." The ceremony proceeded with its usual precision, but for Wicks it carried special meaning. This was his redemption, his proof that he had emerged from the ordeal not just unbroken, but stronger. The uniform he wore was more than cloth, and thread it was a symbol of everything he had fought to preserve. As the morning progressed, Wicks reflected on the lessons learned from his experience. The incident had shown him that courage wasn't just about facing enemy fire or standing up to terrorists. Sometimes it meant standing still, enduring injustice, and maintaining your dignity when everything around you was falling apart. The media had largely moved on to other stories, but the changes set in motion by that rainy day at Heathrow continued to ripple outward. Police training programs now included extensive modules on interacting with military personnel. New protocols ensured that service members would be treated with the respect their service deserved. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about the values that defined British society. What did it mean to serve something greater than yourself? How should a democracy treat those who had sworn to protect it? These were questions that went to the heart of the social contract between citizens and their protectors. Colonel Henshaw, now promoted to brigadier, often used Wicks's story in his speeches to military audiences. "This is what we are," he would say. "Not perfect, but principled. Not invincible, but unbreakable. We face whatever comes with dignity and grace, because that's what the uniform demands." The story of Lance Sergeant Daniel Wicks had become legend within the military community, but the man himself remained remarkably unchanged. He continued to perform his duties with the same quiet professionalism, the same dedication to service, the same belief in something greater than himself. As the sun set over London that evening, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Wicks stood at his barracks window, still in his ceremonial uniform, The events of the past months had changed him, not in obvious ways, but in the quiet depths where character is forged. He had learned that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with restraint, not with violence, but with dignity. The scars from that day at Heathrow had faded, but the lessons remained. He had shown the world what it meant to be a Queen's Guard, not just in the pomp and ceremony, but in the moments when everything was stripped away except the core values that defined them. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Private Matthews, a young recruit who had joined the regiment just weeks after the incident. The boy's eyes held a mixture of awe and uncertainty, the same expression Wicks remembered wearing during his own early days. "Sergeant," Matthews said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you for showing us what it means to serve." Wicks looked at the young soldier, seeing himself reflected in those eager eyes. "You don't serve for thanks, Private. You serve because it's right. Because someone has to stand guard while others sleep. Because the uniform demands nothing less than your best, especially when no one is watching." The young man nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the weight of the words. He would learn, in time, what it truly meant to wear the uniform. They all did, eventually. After Matthews left, Wicks returned to his reflection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. But tonight, he was content to stand watch over a nation that had tested him and found him unbreakable. The uniform hung in his closet, scarlet and gold gleaming even in the dim light. It was more than clothing, it was a covenant, a promise, a sacred trust, and Lance Sergeant Daniel Wicks, bruised but unbroken, would honor that trust for as long as he drew breath. In the end, that was what courage looked like, not the dramatic heroics of battlefield glory, but the quiet determination to stand firm when the world tried to make you kneel. They had cuffed a royal guard that day at Heathrow, but they had never truly captured him. His spirit, his honor, his unshakable commitment to duty, these remained forever beyond their reach, as eternal and unchanging as the crown itself.